Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, of the Praise of Five podcast. Today is episode 17 of Sutton and the Wall Street Trilogy, Wall Street and FDR, part 9. So we left off at chapter 11, The Corporate Socialists at 120 Broadway, New York City. Already he, FDR, began to reappear at the office of the Fidelity and Deposit Company at 120 Broadway. He did not yet visit his law office at 52 Wall Street. Because of the high front steps, he could not bear the thought of being carried up them in public. At 120 Broadway, he could manage by himself the one little step up from the sidewalk. Frank Friedel, Franklin D. Roosevelt, The Ordeal. Page 119. As in Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, we find many of the leading characters, including FDR and firms, even a few of the events described in the book located at the single address, the Equitable Office Building at 120 Broadway, New York City. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's office in the early 1920s, when he was vice president of the Fidelity and Deposit Company, was at 120 Broadway. Biographer Frank Friedel records above his re-entry to the building with his crippling polio attack. At that time, Bernard Baruch's office was also at 120 Broadway. And Hugh Johnson, later to be the administrator of the NRA, was Bernard Baruch's research assistant at the same address. The executive offices of General Electric and the offices of Gerard Swoop, author of the Swoop Plan that became Roosevelt's NRA, were also there. The Bankers Club was on the top floor of the same Equitable Office Building and was the location of 1926 meeting by the Butler Affair plotters. Obviously, there was a concentration of talent at this particular address deserving greater description. The Bolshevik Revolution, 120 Broadway. In Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, we noted that the revolution-related financiers were congregated at a single address in New York City, the same Equitable Office Building. In 1917, the headquarters of No. 2 District of the Federal Reserve System. The most important of the Federal Reserve districts was located at 120 Broadway of 9 directors of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. 4 were physically located at 120 Broadway, and 2 of these directors were simultaneously on the board of American International Corporation. The American International Corporation had been founded in 1915 by the Morgan interests, with the enthusiastic participation by the Rockefeller and Stillman groups. The general offices of AIC were at 120 Broadway. Its directors were heavily interlocked with other major Wall Street financial and industrial interests, and it was determined that American International Corporation had a significant role in the success and consolidation of the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. AIC Executive Secretary William Frank Sands asked for his opinion of the Bolshevik Revolution by the State Department within a few weeks of the outbreak in November of 1917, long before even a fraction of Russia came under Soviet control. Expressed strong support for the revolution. Sands' letter reprinted in Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. A memorandum to David Lloyd George, Prime Minister of England, from Morgan associate Dwight Morrow also urged support for the Bolshevik revolutionaries and backing for its armies. A director of the FRB of New York, William Boyce Thompson, donated $1 million to the Bolshevik cause and intervened with Lloyd George on behalf of the emerging Soviets. In brief, we find an identifiable pattern of pro-Bolshevik activity by influential members of Wall Street, concentrated in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and the American International Corporation, both at 120 Broadway. By 1933, the bank had moved to Liberty Street. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York and 120 Broadway. The names of individual FRB directors changed from between 1917 and the 1930s, but it was determined that although the FRB had moved, 4 FRB directors still had offices at this address in the New Deal period, as shown in the following table. Directors of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in the New Deal period. Name, directorships held for companies located at 120 Broadway. Charles E. Mitchell, Director of FRB at New York, 1929 to 1931, and Director of Corporate Trust Co., 120 Broadway. Albert H. Wiggin succeeded Charles E. Mitchell as Director FRB of New York, 1932 to 34, and Director of American International Corp. And Stone & Webster, Inc., both 120 Broadway. Clarence M. Woolley, Director FRB of New York, 1922 to 1936, and Director General Electric Company, 120 Broadway. Owen D. Young, Director FRB of New York, 1927 to 1935, and Chairman General Electric Company, 120 Broadway. Persons and firms located: 120 Broadway, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Bernard Baruch, Gerard Swoop, Owen D. Young. 420 Broadway, Herbert Clark Hoover. Others: American International Corp., Grayson M.P. Murphy, 520 Broadway. The Corporation Trust Co., International Acceptance Bank. Empire Trust Co., Inc., 52 Cedar Street. Fidelity Trust Co., International Acceptance Trust. American Smelting and Refining Co., 52 Cedar Street. Armor & Co., New York office. International Manhattan Co., Inc., Baldwin Locomotive Works, 52 Cedar Street. Federal Mining and Smelting Co., Jackson Martindale, 14 Wall Street. General Electric Co., John D. Rockefeller, 26 Broadway. Kennecott Copper Corp., Percy A. Rockefeller, 25 Broadway. Metal and Thermite Corp., Robert S. Clark, 11 Wall Street. National Dairy Products Corp., Yukon Gold Corp., Stone & Webster, and Blodgett, Inc. Map of Wall Street showing office locations of persons, firms mentioned in the book. Okay. American International Corporation of 120 Broadway. The American International Corporation was formed in 1915 by a coalition of Morgan, Stillman, and Rockefeller interests. Its general offices were at 120 Broadway from 1915 through the 1920s. The great excitement in Wall Street about formation, I think it should be the formation of AIC, brought about a concentration of the most powerful financial elements on its board of directors. In effect, a monopoly organization for overseas development and exploitation. One of 9 directors on the board in 1930, 5 were on the AIC board in 1917. At the time of the Bolshevik Revolution, Matthew C. Brush, president and chairman of the Executive Committee of American International Corporation and director of the Empire Trust Company. Pierre S. DuPont, member of the DuPont family, and director of the Bankers Trust Company. Percy A. Rockefeller of the Rockefeller family and director of National City Bank. Albert H. Wiggin, director of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and the Rockefeller Chase National Bank, and Beekman Winthrop of the Warburg's International Banking Corporation and the National City Bank. Several prominent financiers joined the board of AIC during the 1920s, including Frank Alschuel and Halstead G. Freeman of the Chase National Bank, Arthur Lehman of Lehman Brothers and the Manufacturers Trust Company, and John J. Raskob, vice president of DuPont and director of General Motors and the Bankers Trust Company. Matthew C. Brush, president, director, and chairman of the Executive Committee of American International Corporation and president of Allied Machinery, a subsidiary company, was also director and member of the Executive Committee of International Acceptance Bank, see Chapter 6, director and member of the Executive Committee of Barnsdale Corporation, director of Empire Trust Company, 120 Broadway, and Equitable Office Corporation, which owned and operated the building at 120 Broadway, director of Georgian Manganese Company, and director and member of the Executive Committee of the Remington Arms Co., identified by General Butler in the last chapter. Matthew C. Brush was indeed in the vanguard of Wall Street. Brush's political contributions, unlike those of other AIC directors, were apparently limited to $5,000 to the campaign of Herbert Hoover in 1928. Brush was director of International Acceptance Bank, which profited from the inflation of the 1920s, as well as the director of the Remington Arms, a suppressed name in the Butler affair, while serving as president of American International, but appeared to have been on the fringes of the occurrences explored in this book. On the other hand, 4 directors of the American International have been identified as substantial financial supporters of Franklin D. Roosevelt: Frank Altshuler, Pierre S. DuPont, Arthur Lehman, and John J. Raskob between 1928 and 1932. The Lehman family and John J. Raskob were, as we have seen, at the very heart of Roosevelt's support. It's significant that AIC, the key vehicle for American participation in the Bolshevik Revolution, should also be unearthed, even in an incidental form, in the study of the Roosevelt era. The Butler Affair in 120 Broadway. Testimony to the House Un-American Activities Committee on the attempt to convert the Roosevelt administration into a dictatorship with Major General Butler in a key role as Secretary of General Affairs had several links to 120 Broadway. There were at least half a dozen persons whom the committee should have subpoenaed to investigate the statements made under oath by General Butler, Captain Glazier, and Paul French. Of these, 4 were located in or had a significant connection with 120 Broadway. According to the accused plotter Gerald McGuire, the original meeting of the alleged participants was held in 1926 at the Bankers Club, 120 Broadway. The following extract from the committee hearings records McGuire's statement. The questioner was Chairman McCormick. Question: How long have you known Clark? Answer: Well, I believe I said that I have done business with him and known him since 1925 or 1926. Question: did he ever give you that kind of money before to use, as you say, in the way that he wanted you to represent him in these transactions? Answer: in what transactions? Question: in these money transactions since that time. Answer: in what money transactions? Question: what I mean is this: since 1926, at the time that you met him and after, this was really the first time that you got this money without any receipt or papers or anything at all. Answer: yes. Question: and this dinner was at the Bankers Club at 120 Broadway, wasn't it? Answer: yes. Question: who was that dinner given to, and was it given to anybody specially? Answer: it was a regular luncheon. Question: who was present at your table? Answer: Mr. Christmas. Question: and yourself? Answer: yes. Question: and Mr. Clark? Answer: yes. Thus, although the original meeting that brought together Robert S. Clark, his attorney Christmas, and bond salesman Gerald Maguire was held at 120 Broadway, and Christmas and Clark were linked in numerous ways to Maguire, neither Christmas nor Clark were called by the committee. Further, Captain Samuel Glazier of the CCC camp at Elkridge, Maryland, reported to the committee that Jackson Martindale had inquired about the trading of 500,000 civilian soldiers for political purposes. Martindale was not called by the committee to challenge or confirm the testimony implicating him in the Butler affair. The DuPont company, cited in the suppressed portion of the testimony, was located at 120 Broadway. Hugh S. Johnson, named by General Butler as a probable participant, had been located at 120 Broadway when working as research assistant to Baruch. Baruch's office was at the same address, 5 Clark, McGuire, and Grayson MP. Murphy had offices just down the street from number 120. Clark at 11 Wall Street and McGuire and Murphy at 52 Broadway. It is also significant that the names suppressed by the committee were located at 120 Broadway, the DuPont Company Executive Office and DuPont subsidiary Remington Arms. The other named participants, McGuire, Clark, Christmas, Martindale, Grayson, MP. Murphy, at Rockefeller Headquarters 25 Broadway, were all located within a few blocks of 120 Broadway and within the previously described Golden Circle. Franklin D. Roosevelt in 120 Broadway. We have noted that FDR's preferred office, he had two in the early 1920s, was the one at 120 Broadway. FDR's Georgia Warm Springs Foundation, Inc. was formed as a Delaware company in July 1926 with offices at 120 Broadway and remained at the address at least through 1936. The 1934 annual report for Georgia Warm Springs Foundation shows that its president was listed as Franklin D. Roosevelt. The White House, Washington, D.C., with the head office of the foundation shown it was 120 Broadway. The vice president and assistant secretary was Raymond H. Taylor, with secretary-treasurer Basil O'Connor, both shown at the 120 Broadway address. Basil O'Connor was a close associate and business partner of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Born in 1892, O'Connor received his law degree from Harvard in 1915 and then joined the New York law firm of Carvath and Henderson for 1 year, leaving to work with Streeter and Holmes in Boston for 3 years. In 1919, Basil O'Connor established a law practice in New York under his own name. In 1925, the firm of Roosevelt and O'Connor was created, lasting until FDR's inauguration in 1933. After 1934, O'Connor was senior partner in O'Connor and Farber, and in 1944 succeeded Norman H. Davis as chairman of the American Red Cross. O'Connor was director of several companies in the 1920s, of the New England Fuel Oil Corps in the 1940s, of the American Reserve Insurance Company, and the West Indies Sugar Corps. From 1928 until his death, he was responsible for the administration of the Georgia Warm Springs Foundation. The Roosevelt New Deal was a goldmine to some of FDR's associates, including Basil O'Connor. Globe and Rutgers was an insurance company recapitalized with government funds, and the reorganization proved a rich source of fees for attorneys handling the liquidation and reorganization. Of these attorneys, President Roosevelt's former firm of O'Connor and Farber demanded the largest single fee until Jesse Jones of Reconstruction Finance Corporation cut it down. Here is a letter of Jesse Jones wrote to Earl of Bali of J&W, Siegelman and Company about these fees, October 1933. Dear Mr. Brawley, our board is unwilling to invest in or lend upon stock in an insurance company if indeed we have the right to do so that contemplates paying such lawyers' fees in reorganization or otherwise as is proposed in the case of the Globe and Rutgers, which we understand from information to be Basil O'Connor, $200,000 US, Root Clark, Buckner, and Ballantine, $165,000, Sullivan and Cromwell, $95,000, Prentice and Townsend, $50,000, Caravath, the Gersdorf, Swain and Wood, $37,500, Martin Conby, $35,000, Joseph E. McKee, $25,000, and the Corder brothers, $12,000, or a total of $619,500. Even the suggested reduction to a total of $426,000 would be very much more than what would appear to this corporation to be proper fees to be paid for an insurance company that is being recapitalized with government funds. Yours very truly, Jesse J. Jones. Under court orders, O'Connor's firm was paid $100,000 in 1934 and $35,000 more the following year. Conclusions about 120 Broadway. It is virtually impossible to develop an unshakable conclusion about the significance of 120 Broadway. Explanations can range from conspiracy to coincidence. What can we prove with direct rather than circumstantial evidence? First, we know that U.S. assistance to the Bolshevik Revolution originated in the Wall Street Golden Circle in 1917 and was heavily concentrated at the particular address. Second, when FDR entered the business world in 1921, one of the two FDR offices was at this address, as was his law partnership with Basil O'Connor and the Georgia Warm Springs Foundation. Third, Bernard Baruch and his assistant Hugh Johnson, later partner of the planning and administration of the National Industrial Recovery Act, were in the same building. NRA was a logical sequel to the trade associations of the 1920s, and FDR had a prominent role, along with Herbert Hoover, in the implementation of trade association agreements in the 1920s. Fourth, there was an association between General Electric and the Bolshevik Revolution, at least in building up the early Soviet Union. Executive offices of GE were at this address, as were those of Gerard Swoop, the president of GE who authored the Swoop Plan. Finally, the bizarre Butler affair had a few links with 120 Broadway. For example, this was DuPont's New York address, although Remington Arms was at Rockefeller headquarters, 25 Broadway. Most of the plotters had other addresses, but still all within the Golden Circle. Nothing is proven by common geographical location. While 120 Broadway was a massive building, it was by no means the largest in New York City. But how does one explain the concentration of so many links to so many important historical events at one address? One could argue that birds of a feather flock together. On the other hand, it is more than plausible that these Wall Streeters were following the maxim laid down by Frederick Howe and found it more convenient or perhaps more efficient for their purposes to be at a single address. The point to hold in mind is that no other such geographical concentration exists, and if we ignore the persons and firms at 120 Broadway, there is no case for any relationship between these historical events and Wall Street, which incidentally is also an excellent reason for retaining one's perspective and accepting the fact that we are discussing a small fraction of the banking community, a fraction that has in effect betrayed the financial center of a free economy. Chapter 12, FDR and the Corporate Socialists. At the first meeting of the cabinet after the president took office in 1933, the financier and advisor to Roosevelt, Bernard Baruch, and Baruch's friend, General Hugh Johnson, who was to become the head of the National Recovery Administration, came in with a copy of a book by Gentile, the Italian fascist theoretician, for each member of the cabinet, and we all read it with great care. Mr. Francis Perkins, Secretary of Labor under FDR. It is worth recalling at this point the epigraph in Chapter 1 that Franklin D. Roosevelt privately believed that the U.S. government was owned by a financial elite. This is, of course, nothing notably original about this observation. It was commonplace in the 19th century. In modern times, it had been averred by such dissimilar writers as Robert Welch and William Domhoff that America is controlled by a financial elite based in New York. The Soviets, who were not always together inaccurate, have used this theme in their propaganda for decades, and it was a Marxist theme before Lenin came along. It was under Roosevelt that quaint Keynesian notions, the modern version of John Law's con game with paper money, were introduced to Washington, and so the seeds of our present economic chaos were laid down in the early 1930s under Roosevelt. Contemporary double-digit inflation, a bankrupt Social Security system, bumbling state bureaucracy, rising unemployment, all this and more can be traced to Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his legislative whirlwind. But while we are now paying the price for these unsound and irresponsible policies, so pervasive is prevailing misinformation that even the identity of the originators of Roosevelt's New Deal and the reasons have been forgotten. While our economists cover their blackboards with meaningless statistic quote equations, static equations, a dynamic looting operation of the economy has been in progress by the authentic formers of the liberal New Deal. While the bleeding heart social engineers have screamed at capitalism as the cause of the world's miseries, they have been blissfully unaware that their own social formulas in part emanated from and have certainly been quietly subsidized by these same so-called capitalists. The tunnel vision of our academic world is hard to beat and equaled only by the avarice for a piece of the action. What we do find is that the government intervention into the economy is the root of our present problems. That Wall Street Coutre has substantive, if subtle, muscle with this government structure to obtain legislation beneficial to itself, and that a prime example of this self-seeking legislation to establish legal monopoly under big business control was FDR's New Deal, and in particular, the National Recovery Administration. The name Franklin Delano Roosevelt should suggest, but rarely does, a link with Wall Street. Both Delano and Roosevelt are prominent names in the history of American financial institutions. Who was Franklin Delano Roosevelt? Roosevelt's pre-political career can be described only as that of a financier. Both his family and career before 1928 and his election as governor of New York were in the business world, more specifically in the financial world. Between 1921 and 1928, Roosevelt was a director of 11 corporations headquartered in the Wall Street Golden Circle and president of a major trade association, the American Construction Council. Furthermore, Roosevelt was not only president of United European Investors Ltd., formed to take pecuniary advantage of the misery of German hyperinflation, but was one of the organizers of American Investigation Corporation, a high-powered financial syndicate. Roosevelt's formed the financial firm Roosevelt and Son in the late 18th century, and Delano's operated in the financial area from at least the mid-19th century. Roosevelt and Delano's may not have been reaping the great wealth of the Morgans and the Rockefellers, but they were known and respected names in the halls of international finance. Even in the 1920s, we find Uncle Frederick Delano on the Federal Reserve Board and George Elman Roosevelt as director of Guaranteed Trust, the beat noir of the street, if there ever was one. It is also reliably recorded that Theodore Roosevelt's Progressive Party, the first step to the modern welfare state, was financed by the J.P. Morgan interests. Consequently, it should not surprise us to find Wall Street backing Roosevelt in 1928, 1930, and 1932. In brief, we have shown that Roosevelt was a Wall Streeter descended from prominent Wall Street families and backed financially by Wall Street. The policies implemented by the Roosevelt regime were precisely those required by the world of international finance. It should not be news to us that the international bankers influence policy. What appears to have been neglected in the history of the Roosevelt era is that not only did FDR reflect their objectives, but was more inclined to do so than the so-called reactionary Herbert Hoover. In fact, Hoover lost in 1932 because, in his own words, he was unwilling to accept the swoop plan, alias NRA, which he termed not incorrectly, a fascist measure. We cannot say that the Wall Streeter Roosevelt was always a highly ethical promoter in his financial flotations. Buyers of his promotions lost money, and substantial money, as the following brief table based on the data presented suggests. How investors fared with FDR at the helm. Company associated with FDR, issue price of stock, subsequent price payout. United European Investors Ltd, 10,000 marks, about $13 US. Company wind up, stockholders offered $7.5 US. International Germanic Trust Company Inc., $170 US, went to $257 in 1928, liquidated in 1930 at $19 US a share. Loss of stockholders' funds, however, can be an accident or mismanagement. Many honest financiers have stumbled. However, associations with persons of known ill repute, such as Roberts and Gould and United European Investors Ltd., was not accidental. FDR's association with the American Construction Council brings to mind Adam Smith's obita dicta that the law cannot hinder people of the same trade from sometimes assembling together, but it ought to do nothing to facilitate such assemblies, much less to render them necessary. Why not? Because the American Construction Council was in the interest of the construction industry, not in those of the consumer or construction services. The New York bonding business was made to order for FDR as vice president of the Fidelity and Deposit Company of Maryland. FDR knew precisely how to operate in the world of politicized business, where price and product quality in the marketplace are replaced by whom do you know and what are your politics. The United European Investors caper was an attempt to take advantage of the misery of the German 1921-23 hyperinflation. The firm operated under a Canadian charter, no doubt because Canadian registration requirements were more lenient at the time. The most conspicuous observation concerns FDR's associates at UEI including John von Barenberg-Gossler, a Hapag co-director of German Chancellor Kuno, who was responsible for the inflation. Then there was William Shaw, FDR's New York associate, who had only a few years earlier been involved with German espionage in the United States at 120 Broadway. The Robert Gould element in the United European Investors was under criminal investigation. FDR knew they were under investigation, but continued as business associations. Then we find that the background of the New Deal was speckled with prominent financiers. The economic recovery part of the New Deal was the creation of Wall Street, specifically Bernard Baruch and George Swoop of General Electric, in the form of the Swoop Plan. So in Chapter 5, we expanded upon the idea of the politicization of business and formulated the thesis of corporate socialism, that the political way of running an economy is more attractive to big business because it avoids the rigors and the imposed efficiency of a market system. Further, through business controller influence and regulatory agencies and the police power of the state, the political system is an effective way to gain a monopoly, and a legal monopoly always leads to wealth. Consequently, Wall Street is intensely interested in the political arena and supports these political candidates, able to maximize the amount of political decision-making under whatever label and minimize the degree to which economic decisions in society are made in the marketplace. In brief, Wall Street has a vested interest in politics because through politics it can make society go to work for Wall Street. It can also thus avoid the penalties and risks of the marketplace. We examine an early version of this idea, Clinton Roosevelt's Planned Economy, published in 1841. We then briefly discuss Bernard Baruch's 1917 economic dictatorship and his declared intent to follow the course of a planned economy in peacetime, and trace Baruch and his economic assistant Hugh Johnson to the very core of the National Recovery Administration. Some attention was then given to Federal Reserve System as the most prominent example of a private legal monopoly, and to the role of the Warburgs, the International Acceptance Bank, and the manner in which the bank was able to get society to go to work for Wall Street. In a final look at the years before FDR's New Deal, we review the operation of the American Construction Council, a trade association, the concept of which originated with Herbert Hoover, but with FDR as its president. The council had, as its stated objectives, limitation of production and regulation of industry, a euphemism for industry controlled for maximization of its own profits. Then we examine the financial contributions of the 1928, 1930, and 1932 elections on the ground that such contributions are very accurate measures of political inclinations. In 1928, an extraordinary percentage of the larger contributions, those over $25,000 US, came from Wall Street's Golden Circle. Such large sums are important because their contributors are more than likely to be identifiable after the election when they ask favors in return for their earlier subsidies. We found that no less than 78.83% of the over $1,000 US contributed to Al Smith for President campaign came from a 1-mile circle centered on 120 Broadway. Similarly, 51.4%, a lesser but still significant figure, of Hoover's contributions came within the same area. Then we demonstrated that after his election, Herbert Hoover was given an ultimatum by Wall Street: either accept the Swoop Plan, the NRA, or the money and influence of Wall Street would go to FDR, who was willing to sponsor that scheme. To his eternal credit, Herbert Hoover refused to introduce such planning on the ground that it was equivalent to Mussolini's fascist state. FDR was not so fussy. In FDR's 1930 campaign for governor of New York, we identified a major Wall Street influence. There was an extraordinary flow of funds via the County Trust Company, and John J. Raskob of DuPont and General Motors emerged as chairman of the Democratic Campaign Committee, and a power behind the scenes in the election of FDR. 78% of the pre-convention early bird contributions for FDR's 1932 presidential bid came from Wall Street. The Swoop Plan was a scheme to force American industry into compulsory trade associations and provide exemption from antitrust laws. It was baited with massive welfare care to quiet the misgivings of labor and other groups. The administrators of the National Recovery Administration, which developed from the Swoop Plan, was Baruch's assistant, General Hugh Johnson. The Three Musketeers, Johnson's circle of assistants, comprised Gerald Swoop of General Electric, Walter Teagle of Standard Oil of New Jersey, and Lewis Kirsten of Philly of Boston. Adherence to the NRA code was compulsory for all firms with more than 50 employees. The Swoop NRA plan was greatly favored by such socialists as Norman Thomas, whose main objection was only that they, the orthodox socialists, were not to run the plan. Fortunately, the NRA failed. Big business attempts to oppress the little man. The codes were riddled with abuses and inconsistencies. It was put out of its misery by the Supreme Court in the Shetler-Poultry decision of 1935, although its failure was evident long before the Supreme Court decision. Because of failure of NRA, the so-called 1934 Butler Affair becomes of particular interest. According to General Smedley Butler's testimony to Congress, supported by independent witnesses, there was a plan to install a dictator in the White House. President Roosevelt was to be kicked upstairs, and a new general secretary, General Butler, was offered. The post was to take over the economy on behalf of Wall Street. Far-fetched as this accusation may seem, we can see isolated three major statements of fact. There were independent confirmation of General Butler's statements, and in some measure unwilling confirmation by one of the plotters. There existed a motive for Wall Street to initiate such a desperate gamble. The NRA swoop proposal was foundering. The alleged identity of the men behind the scenes is the same as those identified in the Bolshevik Revolution and in the political promotion of FDR. Unfortunately, and to its lasting shame, Congress suppressed the core of the Butler testimony. Further, the New York Times first reported the story fairly, but then buried and distorted its coverage, even to the extent of incomplete indexing. We are left with the definite possibility that the failure of the Baruch Swoop Johnson NRA plan was to be followed by a more covert, coercive takeover of American industry. This occurrence deserves the fullest attention that unbiased scholars can bring to it. Obviously, the full story has yet to emerge. Once again, as in the earlier volumes, we find a remarkable connection of persons, firms, and events at a single address, 120 Broadway, New York City. This was FDR's office address as presented by Fidelity and Company Deposit, as president of Fidelity and Deposit Company. It was Bernard Baruch's address and the address of Gerard Swoop, the three main promoters of the National Recovery Administration. FDR, Baruch, and Swoop were located at the same address throughout the 1920s. Most disturbing of all, it was found that the original meetings for the Butler affair was held in 1926 at the Bankers Club, also located at 120 Broadway. No explanation is yet offered for this remarkable concentration of talent and ideas at a single address. Quite obviously, it is an observation that must be accounted for sooner or later. We also found a concentration of directors of American International Corporation, the vehicle for Wall Street involvement in the Bolshevik Revolution, and heavy contributors to the Roosevelt campaign. Can we look at this story in any wider perspective? The ideas behind the Roosevelt New Deal were not really those of Wall Street. They actually go back to Roman times. From 49 to 44 BC, Julius Caesar had his New Deal public works projects. In 91 AD, Domitian had his equivalent of the American Construction Council to stop overproduction. The ultimate fall of Rome reflected all the elements we recognize today: extravagant government spending, rapid inflation, and crushing taxation, all coupled with totalitarian state regulation. Under Woodrow Wilson, Wall Street achieved a central banking monopoly, the Federal Reserve System. The significance of the International Acceptance Bank, controlled by the financial establishment of Wall Street, was that the Federal Reserve banks used the police power of the state to create for themselves a perpetual money-making machine, the ability to create money with a stroke of a pen or the push of a computer key. The Warburgs, a key figure in the International Acceptance Bank, an overseas money-making machine, were advisors to the Roosevelt administration and its monetary policies. Gold was declared a barbaric relic, opening the way to worthless paper money in the United States. In 1975, as we go to press, the fiat incontrovertible dollar is obviously on the way to ultimate depreciation. Did Wall Street recognize the result of removing gold as a backing for the currency? Of course it did. Witness Paul Warburg to a congressional committee. Abandonment of the gold standard means wildly fluctuating foreign exchanges and therefore the destruction of the free inflow of foreign capital and business. Weak countries will repudiate, or to use the more polite expression, fund their debts. But there will be no general demonetization of gold. Gold at the end of the war will not be worth less, but more. The inevitable conclusion forced upon us by the evidence is that there may indeed exist a financial elite, as pointed out by Franklin D. Roosevelt, and that the objective of this elite is monopoly, acquisition of wealth. We have termed this elite advocates of corporate socialism. It thrives on the political process, and it would fade away if it were exposed to the activity of a free market. The great paradox is that the influential world socialist movement, which views itself as the enemy of this elite, is in fact the generator of precisely the politicization of economic activity that keeps the monopoly in power, and that its great hero, Franklin D. Roosevelt, was its self-administered instrument. Let's see here. This must be notes. Okay. FDR, wait, we just read that. FDR and corporate socialists. Let's see here. Oh, this is different. At the first meeting of the cabinet after the president took office in 1933, the financier and advisor to... No, we did read this. Yeah, Domhoff. Okay, hold on. Okay, so where... here we go. Appendix. Swoop plan, Appendix A. All industrial and commercial companies, including subsidiaries with 50 or more employees and doing an interstate business, may form a trade association which shall be under the supervision of a federal body referred to later. 2. These trade associations may outline trade practices, business ethics, methods of standard accounting and cost practice, standard forms of balance sheets and earnings statement, etc., and may collect and distribute information on volume of business transacted, inventories of merchandise on hand, simplification and standardization of products, stabilization of prices, and all matters which may arise from time to time relating to the growth and development of industry and commerce, in order to promote stabilization of employment and give the best service to the public. Much of this sort of exchange of information and data is already being carried on by trade associations now in existence. A great deal more valuable work of this character is possible. 3. The public interest shall be protected by the supervision of companies and trade associations, by the Federal Trade Commission, or by a bureau of the Department of Commerce, or by some federal supervisory body specially constituted. All companies within the scope of this plan shall be required to adopt standard accounting and cost systems and standardized forms of balance sheet earnings statements. These systems and forms may differ for the different industries, but will follow a uniform plan for each industry as adopted by the trade association and approved by the federal supervisory body. 5. All companies with the participants of stockholders numbering 25 or more and living in more than one state shall send its participants or stockholders into the supervisory body at least one each quarter a statement of their business and earnings in a prescribed form. At least each year they shall send to their participants or stockholders and to the supervisory body a complete balance sheet, earnings statements in the prescribed form. In this way, the owners will be kept informed of the conditions of the business in such detail that there may be no criticism of irregularity or infrequency of statements or methods of presentation. Okay. 6. The Federal Trade Supervisory Body shall cooperate with the Internal Revenue Department and the trade associations in developing for each industry standardized forms of balance sheet and income statement depending upon the character of the business for the purpose of reconciling methods of reporting assets and income with the basis of values and income calculated for federal tax purposes. 7. All of the companies of the character described herein may immediately adopt the provisions of this plan, but shall be required to do so within 3 years unless the time is extended by the federal supervisory body. Similar companies formed after the plan becomes effective may come in at once, but shall be required to come in before the expiration of 3 years from the date of their organization unless the time is extended by the federal supervisory body. 8. For the protection of employees, the following plan shall be adopted by all 3 companies. All right, this is an awfully long appendix. We'll leave it here at 8 and pick up next week. So let's see who we have in the chat. Oh, wow. We have a super chat, Michael Pohl, for $10 US, 104 times. Thank you very much, Michael Pohl. Very appreciated. Voltra, GF, and Minoan, thanks for tuning in, everyone. Next week, we will finish FDR and Wall Street and FDR. It's Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.